Laughter might seem effortless, but for medieval jesters and entertainers, it was a matter of survival, a delicate dance between delight and danger. Picture this: a man in motley, his face painted with exaggerated joy, juggling knives before a crowd of nobles. The room erupts in laughter, but beneath the grease paint, his hands tremble. One wrong move, one misplaced joke, and the consequences could be deadly. These performers weren't just the life of the party. They were walking a tightrope over a pit of societal scorn, physical peril, and the constant pressure to entertain. Their lives were a paradox, beloved yet belittled, celebrated yet vulnerable. And here's the twist: their stories aren't just relics of the past. The struggles they faced, the masks they wore, still resonate in the world of entertainment today. Think about the last time you watched a comedian or a circus performer. Did you ever stop to wonder about the person behind the act? Medieval jesters knew this disconnect all too well. They were simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, their pain hidden behind exaggerated grins, their humanity often overlooked. Kings and commoners alike demanded their laughter, but rarely did anyone ask about the cost. These entertainers navigated a world where their worth was measured in moments of mirth, where a single misstep could turn applause into anger. And yet, they persevered, crafting an art form that transcended their era. Their resilience wasn't just about survival. It was about carving out a space where joy could exist, even in the shadows of hardship. So why does their story matter now? Because the mask of the jester is more than a historical curiosity. It's a mirror. Today's entertainers still grapple with many of the same challenges: the pressure to perform, the fear of rejection, the balancing act between authenticity and expectation. By uncovering the daily struggles of medieval jesters, we're not just exploring the past, we're shedding light on the timeless human quest to find meaning in performance. This video is your invitation to step behind the curtain, to see the world through their eyes, and perhaps, in doing so, to understand the unspoken sacrifices that shape the laughter we take for granted. The journey begins now. Behind the colorful costumes and exaggerated antics, medieval jesters wielded a surprising amount of influence, one that went far beyond simple entertainment. These sharp-witted performers occupied a unique space in royal courts, serving as the only people who could openly mock kings and nobles without immediate punishment. But this privilege came with razor-thin margins for error. A well-timed joke about a ruler's failed military campaign might earn laughter today, and a dagger in the back tomorrow. Their humor was a double-edged sword, disarming tensions, while secretly exposing truths no one else dared to voice. Take the legendary Jester, who served King Louis XII of France. When the monarch jokingly threatened to execute him for an insult, shot back, "You wouldn't dare. The church forbids killing a fool without cause." The court erupted in laughter, but the subtext was deadly serious. He just exposed the king's capriciousness under the guise of comedy. This was the jester's true power. They could hold up a funhouse mirror to society, reflecting its flaws in a way that made them digestible. Yet their role stretched even further. Many jesters acted as unofficial therapists, using humor to diffuse courtly tensions or soothe a ruler's temper. Others served as discreet messengers, carrying sensitive information between factions under the cover of their foolish persona. Some even doubled as spies, gathering intelligence while appearing harmless. Their motley costumes weren't just for show. They were camouflage, allowing them to move through social hierarchies unseen. But perhaps their most fascinating contradiction was this: the very traits that made them invaluable also made them expendable. A jester who pushed too far might be dismissed, or worse. Their safety hinged on their ability to read a room, to balance truth with tact. In many ways, they were the original social satirists, proving that laughter could be both a weapon and a shield. And while their world was vastly different from ours, the echoes of their struggle still resonate in every comedian who walks on stage, microphones in hand, ready to walk that same tightrope between truth and consequence. The glittering halls of medieval courts weren't just stages for laughter. They were where a single misplaced word could spell disaster. For jesters, satire wasn't just entertainment. It was a high-stakes game of verbal chess played against kings and nobles who held absolute power over their fate. These performers mastered the art of speaking truth to power through layers of metaphor, disguising biting commentary as harmless tomfoolery. A jest about a greedy badger stealing eggs might secretly critique a tax-hungry lord, while a bawdy song about a cuckolded blacksmith could slyly mock a duke's infidelities. But the line between clever and criminal was perilously thin. Consider the tragic case of the jester Roland the Red, who served in the court of Duke of Bavaria. After mocking the duke's failed hunt with a pantomime of a nobleman tripping over his own hounds, Roland found himself stripped of his colors and banished to the frozen woods, a death sentence in winter. His crime: revealing truth too plainly, without the protective veil of ambiguity that kept most jesters safe. This was the constant tightrope walk: entertain without offending, challenge without threatening, speak without truly saying. The most skilled jesters developed an entire secret language of survival. They'd use call-and-response songs where the crowd's participation provided plausible deniability, or plant satirical barbs in the mouths of puppet characters. Some kept fools, licenses, actual written permissions from rulers allowing limited mockery, though these scraps of parchment offered little real protection when tempers flared. Even physical comedy became a shield. By tumbling at just the right moment or pretending to misunderstand a noble's words, they could redirect anger into laughter. Yet the risks weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. Many jesters developed what we now recognize as performance anxiety or depression, their public joviality masking private torment. Church records from 15th century York describe one entertainer who did laugh by day and weep by night, his mirth a millstone about his neck. The psychological toll of this double life was immense, as they constantly suppressed genuine emotions to maintain their roles as perpetual merrymakers. What makes their struggle so poignant is how familiar it feels today. Modern comedians still face backlash for controversial material. Social media satirists navigate cancel culture, and even corporate clowns endure the exhaustion of perpetual cheerfulness. The medieval jester's dilemma reflects a timeless truth. Laughter often comes at the cost of the laugher, and the right to speak truth demands the courage to face consequences. Their stories remind us that behind every joke, there's a human being walking that same knife's edge between humor and hazard. Behind every cartwheel and pratfall lay a body pushed to its limits, and often beyond. Medieval entertainers didn't just perform feats of agility and strength. They sacrificed their physical well-being for the sake of spectacle. Imagine a tumbler launching himself across a castle's great hall, landing on unforgiving stone floors night after night. No padded mats, no supportive footwear, just raw impact reverberating through joints already worn thin from years of abuse. These performers didn't retire with standing ovations. They limped into obscurity, their bodies bearing the hidden cost of every laugh they'd ever earned. The injuries were as varied as they were brutal. Jugglers who worked with flaming torches or weighted knives risked severe burns and deep lacerations. Acrobats suffered snapped tendons and shattered kneecaps from high falls onto hard surfaces. Even seemingly harmless slapstick routines took a toll. Repeated staged blows to the head led to chronic pain, while exaggerated pratfalls could compress spines over time. Medical care was primitive at best. Broken bones might be set by a barber surgeon, but infections and improper healing were constant threats. Many entertainers developed what we now recognize as degenerative conditions: arthritis, herniated discs, or nerve damage, leaving them in unrelenting pain long before old age. What makes their suffering particularly haunting is how invisible it remained. Audiences saw the dazzling flips and heard the exaggerated yelps of comic pain, but not the sleepless nights spent nursing swollen joints or the quiet desperation of performers who could no longer earn their keep. Historical records hint at this silent crisis. Parish registers from 14th century England list multiple entertainers buried with occupational descriptions like broken tumbler or lame fool. Some jesters resorted to dangerous pain relievers, opium-laced tonics or alcohol binges, just to keep performing. The contrast to modern performers is stark. Today's circus artists train with shock-absorbing floors, physical therapists, and regulated work hours. Medieval entertainers had none of these safeguards. Their careers were short, their retirements bleak. Yet they persisted, driven by passion, necessity, or simply the lack of alternatives. Their legacy isn't just in the laughs they provoked, but in the unspoken endurance they embodied, a reminder that every ounce of joy they created was paid for in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They stood at the center of the crowd, yet never truly belonged. Medieval jesters were the ultimate insiders who remained forever on the outside. Picture the scene: a banquet hall roaring with laughter as the jester performs, his antics drawing nobles and servants alike into shared merriment. But when the feast ends, the others return to their families, their communities, while he retreats to solitary quarters. This was the cruel paradox of his existence. Beloved in the moment, forgotten in the aftermath, his role as perpetual entertainer leaving no room for genuine connection. The isolation ran deeper than mere physical solitude. In noble courts, jesters were treated as human luxuries, prized possessions rather than people. Kings might confide in them, but never as equals. A ruler could share his deepest fears with a jester one night and have him whipped for an ill-timed joke the next. Among commoners, the stigma was worse. Many saw these performers as cursed or touched by madness, their unnatural ability to mock authority marking them as dangerous outsiders. Church records from 13th century France even describe towns forcing jesters to live beyond city walls, fearing their unholy laughter would attract divine punishment. This social limbo took a brutal psychological toll. Without peers or protectors, many jesters developed coping mechanisms that only deepened their alienation. Some adopted exaggerated personas, losing themselves so completely in their fool's mask that they struggled to remove it off stage. Others turned to reckless behavior, gambling, heavy drinking, or provoking increasingly dangerous stunts, as if testing how far society would let them fall. The few surviving personal accounts paint heartbreaking pictures. One anonymous jester's diary, discovered in a German monastery, contains a passage that reads, "They call me fool, yet none see the greater folly, that I make hundreds laugh but cannot name a single soul who knows my tears." Even their rare friendships were fraught with tension. Close bonds with fellow entertainers risked professional jealousy, while relationships with non-performers often foundered on misunderstanding. A poignant example comes from the story of a 15th century jester who fell in love with a seamstress. Her family forbade the match, declaring, "No daughter of ours will wed a man who trades his dignity for coins." When persisted, they fled the town under cover of night. Such rejections reinforced what many jesters already suspected. Their art made them cherished, but never chosen, desired, but never respected. Yet within this loneliness lay an unexpected power. Unbound by conventional ties, jesters became keen observers of human nature. Their isolation granted them clarity, allowing them to spot hypocrisy and injustice that others overlooked. Like courtly canaries in the coal mine, they sensed shifting social winds before anyone else, a survival skill born from perpetual vulnerability. Modern psychologists might recognize this as heightened emotional intelligence, forged in the crucible of exclusion. The echoes of their struggle resonate today in every comedian who feels like an outsider at their own after-party, every influencer surrounded by followers yet starved for authentic connection. The medieval jester's loneliness reveals a timeless truth about performance. The brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadows it casts. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the laughter and see the person behind the performance, not just then, but now. The glittering coins tossed at a jester's feet often told a lie, one that hid the brutal economics behind the laughter. While history remembers the legendary fools who dined at royal tables, the truth is most entertainers lived one bad performance away from starvation. Take the account of Thomas, the tumbler, recorded in the ledgers of an English noble household in the year 1392. His weekly pay amounted to 3 pence, less than the cost of a single chicken at market. And this was a fortunate man, employed year-round. Many others survived on seasonal work, traveling between fairs and feast days, never knowing where their next meal might come from. The disparity between top performers and struggling artists would feel familiar today, but with far deadlier stakes. A select few jesters attached to wealthy courts might receive fine clothes, their own servants, even parcels of land. The famous jester served French King Henry III with such distinction that he was granted a small estate. Yet these cases were exceptional. For every, there were hundreds like Margot the minstrel, whose body was discovered in a Paris alley in 1405 with nothing but a broken lute and 12 copper coins, her entire worldly wealth. What made their poverty particularly cruel was its invisibility. Entertainers were expected to maintain appearances regardless of their circumstances. A juggler couldn't show up to a noble's feast in patched clothing, so many spent their last coins on costumes while going hungry. Guild records from Flanders reveal entertainers pawning their instruments in winter, only to desperately repurchase them come spring, a cycle that kept them perpetually indebted. The fickleness of patronage added another layer of peril. Unlike modern contracts, medieval entertainers worked at the complete mercy of their patrons. A duke's changing mood, a bishop's disapproval of certain jokes, even something as trivial as a noble child taking dislike to a performer could end careers overnight. The case of the Jester illustrates this brutal reality. After 20 years serving the family in Milan, a single ill-received satire about the Lord's new tax policy saw him dismissed without pension. He died 2 winters later in a pauper's hospice, his name scratched from the family chronicles. Women in entertainment faced even greater financial instability. Female minstrels and acrobats were often paid half what men received for the same acts, and their careers typically ended by 30, whether from exhaustion, injury, or the expectation they'd marry. The story of the juggler survives in a Munich court document from 1488, where she petitions for back wages after being fired for becoming pregnant. The ruling. She received 1/3 the amount owed, with the judge noting, "A breeding woman hath no place in the theater of fools." This precarious existence forced many entertainers into dangerous side hustles. Some turned to petty theft. A tumbler's agility made them excellent cut purses. Others performed increasingly reckless stunts for extra coins, like the fire eater, who reportedly swallowed burning pitch for a noble's wager in Rouen. Church registries show entertainers frequently moonlighting as messengers, spies, or even mercenaries when times grew desperate. What's most striking is how little changed across centuries. While today's entertainers have unions and royalties, the fundamental insecurity remains. The medieval jester's struggle mirrors the modern gig economy, always hustling, never secure, trading talent for survival. Their stories remind us that behind every age's laughter lies the same unspoken question. How much is joy truly worth to those who created history, remembers the loudest voices? But the whispers of medieval female entertainers tell a far more revealing story. While male jesters battled for respect, women in performance faced a gauntlet of prejudice that doubled their burdens. They had to be twice as clever, twice as skilled, and twice as careful just to survive. Consider the early 15th century performer who disguised herself as a man to compete in physical comedy contests. When her wig fell off during a particularly raucous routine, the crowd's laughter turned to fury, not at the deception, but at being tricked into applauding a woman. Her story survives only because a local friar recorded it as a cautionary tale about feminine deceit. The obstacles began with basic access. Guild records from across Europe show women barred from formal training in juggling, acrobatics, and even musical performance under statutes like the 1324 London Minstrels Ordinance, which declared female performers unseemly unless singing sacred music. Those who persisted often learned in secret, like Marguerite of Flanders, who famously practiced tumbling in her family's barn at night, only to be denounced by neighbors as possessed when her skills became public. Church sermons routinely linked female entertainers with witchcraft, their physical agility reinterpreted as demonic possession, and their comic timing as unholy persuasion. Yet the most insidious challenges came from audiences themselves. Male performers could mock nobility with relative impunity, but women faced immediate retaliation for similar boldness. The Chronicles of Burgundy recount how the jester was publicly whipped in 1462 after joking about Duchess Isabella's extravagant hats, a routine her male counterpart had performed about the Duke's hunting failures without consequence. Double standards extended to payment too. Tax rolls from Venice show female minstrels earning 30% less than men for the same acts at the Doge's palace. Some women turned these prejudices into power. The German trick writer, Hagen circumvented restrictions by performing as a living statue motionless until coins hit her plate, then erupting into breathtaking acrobatics that bypassed expectations of feminine modesty. Others, like Beatrice, the balladeer, crafted entire personas around maternal wisdom, disarming critics by framing satire as folksy advice from a kindly village woman. Their ingenuity created loopholes in a system stacked against them. The erasure of their legacies cuts deepest. While chroniclers meticulously recorded male jesters' witticisms, women's contributions were often attributed to male colleagues or omitted entirely. The few surviving fragments hint at what we've lost, like the anonymous Dame of the Bells, described in a French traveler's journal, whose biting political parodies delivered through puppet shows reportedly sparked 3 separate riots. These artists didn't just entertain. They shaped culture from the shadows, their influence persisting even as their names vanished from record. What makes their resilience extraordinary is that they persevered without hope of legacy. Today's performers chase fame and lasting recognition, but medieval women entertainers knew their stories would likely die with them. They danced on tables knowing no one would remember their names, sang ballads aware their voices would fade unrecorded. That they created anyway, defying danger and disregard, speaks to a courage far beyond the call of entertainment. Their ghosts challenge us to listen harder, to look closer at history's margins, where the bravest voices often whisper. The Church's relationship with medieval jesters was a paradox wrapped in holy robes, simultaneously condemning their mockery while secretly relying on their truth-telling. On the surface, ecclesiastical authorities denounced entertainers as agents of moral decay. A 13th century papal decree from Pope Innocent III declared theatrical performances the devil's scripture, singling out satirical acts that dared to lampoon clergy. Bishops across Europe reinforced this stance, like the Bishop of Winchester, who in 1341 ordered all jesters within his diocese to wear bells as markers of their sinful tongues. Yet beneath this public scorn lay an unspoken truth. The Church needed these very fools it persecuted. Consider the case of Brother, a Franciscan friar who secretly penned satirical plays under the alias Foolish Timothy. His skits mocking greedy abbots and lustful priests became underground sensations until his identity was discovered in 1402. Rather than excommunicate him, the local archbishop quietly reassigned him to write morality tales that continued his critiques in thinly veiled allegory. This uneasy dance between condemnation and co-option reveals the Church's dilemma. Jesters held up mirrors to corruption that sermons couldn't address directly, their humor allowing truths to circulate that would be treasonous if spoken plainly. The persecution was real nonetheless. Parish records from France's region show at least 18 entertainers tried for heresy between 1350 and 1420, their crimes ranging from puppet shows depicting hell as a tavern to ballads comparing cardinals to fattened geese. Some accusations veered into the absurd, like the traveling minstrel peer who was flogged for sorcery after making a mitre dance on his finger during a street performance. Women faced especially harsh scrutiny. The mystic-turned-jester Beatrice of Provence was burned at the stake in 1389 not for her unorthodox visions, but for staging them as comic monologues that drew huge crowds. Yet the most fascinating clashes occurred when jesters turned their satire directly on religious hypocrisy. The famed performer became legendary for disguising himself as a pilgrim to expose corrupt relic sellers, once filling a fake saint's bone with honey to demonstrate how easily the faithful were duped. His exploits walked a dangerous line, enough truth to resonate, enough humor to avoid execution. This balancing act defined the era's most subversive entertainers. They mastered the art of coded criticism, like the Italian troupe who performed The Trial of the Melon, disguising a scathing indictment of ecclesiastical courts as slapstick about vegetable theft. What emerges from these stories isn't just a tale of oppression, but of quiet rebellion. When the church banned parody hymns, jesters responded with drinking songs that used sacred melodies for profane lyrics, knowing congregations would recognize the tunes instantly. When bishops forbade clergy from attending performances, entertainers staged shows just outside cathedral walls during feast days. Their persistence reveals an uncomfortable truth for religious authorities. Laughter cannot be controlled, and truth wrapped in jest slips past even the most vigilant gatekeepers. The echoes of this struggle resonate today wherever artists challenge dogma, wherever power seeks to silence satire under the guise of piety. The medieval jester's battle with the church reminds us that humor has always been more than entertainment. It's a survival tool for speaking truth when direct speech is forbidden, a flickering candle in the darkness of orthodoxy. The road was both home and hazard for medieval traveling troops, a ribbon of dust and danger stretching between uncertain welcomes. Unlike court jesters who slept under noble roofs, these roving bands of acrobats, musicians, and comic actors knew no such security. Their lives unfolded mile by weary mile, their fortunes rising and falling with each new town's whims. A troupe might bask in applause one evening, only to flee at dawn from stones thrown by villagers who decided their tricks were witchcraft. Survival demanded more than talent. It required streetwise strategy. Seasoned performers developed intricate systems to navigate the perils of medieval travel. Some adopted coded markings on trees and fences to warn others of hostile territories or generous patrons ahead. Others traveled with guard dogs trained to sniff out ambushes, a necessity given how frequently entertainers were targeted by. Records from a 14th century Italian merchant's ledger note that traveling players often paid double the usual rate for armed escorts, as their colorful wagons made irresistible targets for thieves. Weather alone could spell disaster. The account of troupe, preserved in a French monastery's marginalia, details how an unseasonal snowstorm trapped them in the Alps for 17 days in 1384. With their costumes burned for warmth and 2 members lost to frostbite, they arrived in Geneva too broken to perform, surviving on church alms. Such tragedies were commonplace. Spring floods washed away roads. Summer droughts left performers drinking from mud puddles, and autumn rains turned paths into quagmires that claimed wagons and lives alike. Yet the greatest danger often waited in the towns themselves. Local authorities viewed traveling troops with deep suspicion, fearing they'd spread disease or incite unrest. Municipal records from across Europe are filled with ordinances requiring performers to wear identifying badges or forbidding them from staying more than 3 nights. In Bavaria, a troops leader might be imprisoned if any member was caught begging, a cruel irony given how frequently famine or plague left them no choice. The hostility ran deeper than bureaucracy. Rural communities often saw outsiders as threats to their moral order. Church frescoes from the period frequently depict entertainers alongside demons, reinforcing the connection between itinerant performers and sin. In 1391, an entire troupe in Lincolnshire was arrested after a harvest festival performance allegedly caused cattle to stop giving milk. Though eventually released, their instruments were burned as instruments of the devil. Amidst these hardships, troops developed remarkable resilience. They became masters of cultural adaptation, tailoring acts to local sensibilities, pious ballads for convent towns, ribaldry for merchant fairs. Some carried multiple sets of costumes, humble garb for conservative regions, lavish silks for wealthy patrons. They traveled with letters of recommendation from previous hosts, though these offered scant protection against mobs stirred up by fire and brimstone preachers. What's most striking is how they turned transients into strength. Unlike court-bound jesters, traveling performers absorbed stories from every corner of Europe, becoming living repositories of folklore and news. A Sicilian puppeteer might blend Moorish shadow plays with German morality tales, while a French tumbler could incorporate Slavic dance moves into her routine. This cross-pollination created the first glimmers of a shared European entertainment culture, one that transcended borders, even as those same borders made their lives a daily gamble. Their legacy lingers in every modern busker's battered guitar case, every carnival worker's weather-beaten face. The medieval troupe's nomadic existence reminds us that entertainment has always been a high-wire act, not just in performance, but in survival. They danced on the knife's edge between celebration and scorn, their laughter ringing louder precisely because it might be silenced tomorrow. The Jester's motley wasn't just clothing, it was camouflage and cape rolled into one. Those bright, mismatched patches served as a billboard announcing their role to the world. Yet beneath the garish fabric lay hidden bruises, both physical and emotional. A performer's costume functioned like a knight's armor, but with a cruel twist. While plate mail deflected blows, the jester's silks absorbed them, transforming wearers into walking targets. The very uniform that granted them permission to speak dangerous truths also painted a bullseye on their backs. Take the iconic pointed cap with jingling bells, a seemingly whimsical accessory that carried layers of meaning. The bells weren't just for merriment. They served as an early warning system, announcing the jester's presence so nobles could adjust their conversations. Yet that same cheerful chime could become a humiliation tool, as described in a 15th century Flemish account, where a disgraced jester was forced to wear bells on his ankles for a month after offending a bishop. The costume's elements often pulled in opposite directions. The floppy shoes allowed for exaggerated tumbles, but made escape from angry crowds nearly impossible, while the garish colors that ensured visibility in dimly lit halls also marked performers for abuse in the streets. The physical toll of these costumes went far beyond discomfort. Court tailors prioritized spectacle over practicality, crafting garments that could weigh upwards of 20 pounds with their layers of quilted fabric, dangling ornaments, and reinforced stitching to withstand nightly abuse. A German physician's journal from 1412 describes treating a jester for chronic shoulder damage caused by his oversized, coin-weighted collar, an injury not unlike modern repetitive strain disorders. Many performers developed rashes from cheap dyes or infections from unwashed costumes, their sweat-soaked garb becoming breeding grounds for disease. The account of Roland the Ribald, a Burgundian jester who died of blood poisoning from a costume pin embedded in his thigh, reveals the grim reality behind the glitter. Yet for all its burdens, the motley granted a peculiar kind of power. Like a theatrical mask, it allowed performers to dissociate from their actions. The insults came from the fool, not the person. Some jesters took this further, using costume changes to create alter egos. Records from the court of Aragon mention a jester named who wore different colored caps for different modes. Red for biting political satire, green for harmless slapstick, black for delivering uncomfortable truths under the guise of mourning the world's folly. This early form of psychological compartmentalization helped preserve their sanity in impossible situations. The costume's social weight proved equally complex. While fine silks from patrons' gifts might elevate a jester's status temporarily, they could never erase his essential otherness. A surviving inventory from the estate of England's Duke of Suffolk lists his jester's wardrobe alongside the hunting dogs, embroidered collars, a telling categorization. For women performers, the costuming tightrope was even more precarious. The infamous proclamation of 1465 forbade female entertainers from wearing the tall conical hats popular with nobility, forcing them to adopt humbler headwear that marked them as lower class. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was how these costumes outlived their wearers. Unlike knights, armor preserved in museums, nearly no complete jester outfits survive, discarded as rags when worn out or burned during plague years for fear of contagion. The few fragments that remain, like a single bell-studded sleeve in a Prague museum, speak volumes about their dual nature. The velvet is worn thin from countless performances, the stitches reinforced where laughter turned to violence. The once vibrant dyes faded like the memories of those who wore them. Their legacy lingers in every modern comedian's stage persona, every actor's transformation under lights, reminders that performance armor always comes at a price, whether sewn in silk or forged in steel. The painted smile of a jester often concealed a soul in torment, an unbearable tension between the persona demanded by audiences and the human being struggling beneath. Unlike modern performers who might clock out after a show, medieval entertainers lived without respite, their identities so fused with their roles that even private moments offered no escape. Court records from 15th century describe a jester named Lope who was fined for appearing at a funeral without his motley, the judge declaring, "A fool hath no face but his mask." This expectation of perpetual performance created psychological wounds that medieval medicine lacked even the language to describe. The isolation was crushing. While today we recognize the symptoms of burnout and depression, medieval jesters suffered in silence, their anguish dismissed as melancholy or worse, moral failure. A heartbreaking entry in the diary of an anonymous English jester reads, "They bid me dance upon the table when my heart lies buried with my stillborn child." Without outlets for genuine grief or anger, many turned to dangerous coping mechanisms. Apothecary logs from German towns show entertainers purchasing opium-laced merry tonics at triple the rate of other professions, while French tavern ledgers note jesters consistently drinking until insensate, a desperate attempt to quiet minds that knew only how to perform. The most tragic cases reveal how thoroughly the mask consumed the wearer. In 1488, the court physician to Duke of documented a peculiar malady affecting the aging jester. He laughs in his sleep, his face frozen in that grotesque grin even as tears wet his pillow. What we now diagnose as severe anxiety manifested then as the fool's madness, blamed on an excess of black bile or demonic influence. Treatment ranged from useless to barbaric, herbal poultices, forced bleedings, or in one horrific account from Burgundy, the application of hot irons to drive out the laughing devil. Women entertainers faced compounded trauma. Expected to embody both mirth and modesty, they navigated impossible contradictions. The story of the tumbler illustrates this vividly. After being assaulted by a nobleman following a performance in 1402, she was accused of provocation through lewd gymnastics when she sought justice. Many female performers developed what physicians called the silent sickness, a condition marked by sudden muteness alternating with exaggerated cheer. Modern psychologists would recognize this as dissociative disorder, a mind fracturing under unsustainable pressure. Yet within this darkness flickered moments of profound resilience. Some jesters found covert ways to process their pain, like the German performer who carved tiny wooden figures, each representing an emotion he could never show, and secretly floated them down rivers at night. Others turned their suffering into art, like the anonymous ballad writer who penned The Fool's Lament, a song so raw it circulated for centuries in coded versions. Their struggles laid bare a universal truth. Performance demands sacrifice, but no applause can heal wounds inflicted by the very masks that earn it. The echoes of their pain resonate wherever entertainers today push through panic attacks to take the stage, or comedians battle depression between shows. The medieval jesters' invisible battles remind us that laughter often springs from the deepest wells of sorrow, and that the right to bring joy should never require the surrender of one's humanity. Their legacy isn't just in the laughs they left behind, but in the unspoken cost those laughs entailed, a price we're only beginning to acknowledge. The path to becoming a jester wasn't paved with laughter. It was carved in blood, sweat, and broken bones. Imagine a child of 7 or 8, ripped from their family and handed over to a master entertainer, their tiny body pressed into service as an apprentice. The training regime they faced would make modern circus schools seem like gentle playgrounds. Days began before dawn with brutal flexibility exercises, limbs stretched beyond natural limits, backs bent until spines popped, all while masters stood ready with switches to correct any slackening of effort. Historical accounts from German guild scrolls describe young tumblers practicing somersaults over wooden beams studded with nails, the threat of impalement sharpening their focus. Physical torture was only half the curriculum. Apprentices memorized hundreds of jokes, songs, and satirical verses, their tongues lashed with vinegar-soaked reeds for every flubbed line. A French training manual from the 1400s outlines the fool's ladder, a grueling progression from basic slapstick to dangerous political satire. Beginners might spend months perfecting pratfalls onto stone floors before being allowed to attempt juggling. Those who showed promise in mimicry faced special torment. Records from a Venetian troupe describe trainees forced to hold grotesque facial expressions for hours, their cheeks pinned back with to fix their grins. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Masters deliberately shattered apprentices' self-esteem to mold them into pliable performers. A heartbreaking diary survives from a 14-year-old trainee in Burgundy, his pages filled with frantic scribbles. Master says I'm worth less than his left shoe. Today he made me bark for scraps while nobles laughed. Many developed what medieval physicians called the shaking sickness, a combination of chronic anxiety and muscle tremors from relentless stress. Church shelters frequently took in runaway apprentices, their bodies from beatings, their minds fractured by humiliation. Women faced even initiation rites. Female acrobats were forced to train in lead-weighted dresses to temper their lightness, while singers had their vocal cords scorched with hot mead to produce the raspy, comic tones audiences favored. The memoir of the Spanish performer Isabella recounts being suspended in a cage above her master's stage for 3 days without water, punishment for forgetting a single verse in her debut. Yet the most insidious damage came from the systematic erasure of identity. Apprentices were stripped of their birth names and rebranded with mocking titles like Simple or Clumsy Kate. Guild contracts explicitly forbade them from marrying or bearing children until completing their decade-long training, ensuring no competing loyalties diluted their devotion to performance. What emerged from this ordeal wasn't just an entertainer, but a hollowed-out vessel for others, amusement, a person trained to equate pain with applause, abuse with affection. The rare survivors who achieved mastery carried these scars into their art. The legendary Jester's infamous melancholy, the way Italian performer satire cut straight to the bone, these weren't mere stylistic choices, but the inevitable fruits of a system that cultivated genius through brutality. Their training left them exquisitely attuned to human cruelty, able to manipulate laughter because they'd learned its price in blood. This dark legacy lingers in entertainment today, in the child stars who crack under pressure, the comedians who weaponize their trauma for laughs. The medieval jester's apprenticeship reveals an uncomfortable truth about performance. Sometimes the greatest art grows from the deepest wounds, and the loudest laughter springs from the most silent suffering. Laughter in the medieval court wasn't just entertainment. It was a weapon, sharpened and aimed by those who understood its power. Kings and nobles didn't merely tolerate jesters. They weaponized them, turning humor into a diplomatic dagger cloaked in motley. A carefully planted joke about a rival lord's failed harvest could incite riots among his starving peasants. A bawdy song mocking another kingdom's military blunders might circulate through taverns for months, eroding morale before a battle even began. These weren't accidents. They were calculated strikes, with jesters as unwitting ammunition in wars waged through wit. Take the infamous case of the facetious, a jester in the service of Duke Charles of Burgundy. In 1468, Charles ordered to perform a skit depicting the King of France as a bumbling shepherd losing his flock, a not-so-subtle jab at territorial losses. The performance sparked such outrage that it became a rallying cry for French forces, escalating a Cold War into open conflict. When later tried to flee, Charles had his tendons slit to prevent him from defecting. This brutal lesson echoed through courts everywhere. A jester's tongue could start fires, but their body would burn first. The manipulation ran deeper than public mockery. Clever rulers used jesters as covert messengers, their foolish antics providing cover for sensitive communications. A juggler might pause mid-routine to whisper a threat in a noble's ear, disguised as a comic aside. A tumbler's acrobatics could conceal the passing of folded documents between factions. The Venetian archives contain a chilling account from 1421, where a jester's puppet show contained coded instructions for an assassination plot, discovered only after the target's poisoning. Women entertainers faced even greater peril as political pawns. The tragic story of Marguerite the Minstrel reveals how gender compounded these dangers. Hired by Countess of Hainaut to sing satirical ballads about her estranged husband's impotence, Marguerite was captured by the Count's men and subjected to the very humiliation she'd mocked, her tongue branded with a hot iron in a grotesque parody of justice. Such retaliation wasn't uncommon. Female performers were seen as doubly transgressing, their gender making them easier targets for brutal reprisals. What made this system particularly vicious was its deniability. When a jester's joke sparked unrest, rulers could feign innocence merely a fool's prattle while reaping the benefits. The Saxon chronicles describe how Emperor Maximilian once provoked a rebellion in Bohemia by having his jester, accidentally, drop a cartoon depicting local nobles as gluttonous pigs during a diplomatic banquet. By the time tensions erupted, the jester had already been punished with a ceremonial whipping, a theatrical absolution that fooled no one. This shadow war of wit left performers trapped in an impossible bind, refused to participate and face dismissal or worse, comply and become complicit in schemes that might get them killed. The Diary of the English Jester will contains a haunting entry from 1536. Today I made a king laugh and a queen weep with the same jest. God help me, I know not which was the greater sin. His anguish captures the moral quicksand these entertainers navigated, praised for cruelty one moment, punished for honesty the next. The echoes of this manipulation reverberate today, from late-night comedy writers walking political tightropes to social media satirists, becoming unwitting tools of propaganda. The medieval jester's plight reminds us that laughter is never neutral. It's a force that can topple kingdoms or crush the powerless, depending on who holds the strings. Their stories challenge us to ask, when we laugh along with the jester, who's really pulling the jokes when plague darkened a village or drought cracked the fields? Medieval communities reached for an ancient remedy, finding someone to blame. All too often, their fingers pointed toward the jester. That same laughter that had lifted spirits in good times became suspect in bad, the performers motley now seen as a cloak for malevolence rather than mirth. Parish records from Normandy tell of a traveling troupe driven into a river with pitchforks in 1388 after a stillborn calf was discovered following their performance. No evidence connected them to the tragedy, only the poisonous logic that linked novelty with danger, difference with doom. The psychology behind this scapegoating reveals a cruel irony. Jesters were hired precisely because they stood outside social norms, Yet that very otherness made them vulnerable when fear took hold. Church sermons stoked these fires, with preachers like of Siena warning that he who makes unnatural mirth invites unnatural punishment. A jester's physical agility, normally a source of wonder, became evidence of demonic possession during witch panics. Their sharp tongues, once celebrated for cleverness, were recast as curses made flesh. The account of the fool, tried in Milan in 1421, lays bare this hysteria. Charged with causing a noblewoman's sudden blindness through malicious jests, he was subjected to a mock trial where his every joke was parsed for hidden blasphemies. When he reflexively quipped that the court needed spectacles more than he did, it sealed his fate. 3 days in the stocks, his hands crushed beneath millstones. Women entertainers faced even deadlier accusations. The line between healer and witch blurred dangerously for those who incorporated folk remedies into performances. Margarita of, a tumbler known for herbal cures, was burned in 1406 after a bad harvest, her satchel of chamomile and dandelions branded devil's provisions. Ballad singers risked charges of cursing if their songs coincided with misfortune. A haunting woodcut from a German chronicle shows a minstrel woman being paraded backward on a donkey, a punishment reserved for those suspected of casting the evil eye through music. The tools of their trade became damning evidence. Jugglers, colored balls were said to hypnotize victims, while puppet masters faced allegations of using dolls for sympathetic magic. In England's Peak District, 12 puppeteers were hanged in a single month in 1392 after a local lord's son choked on a piece of mutton, their crime, performing a skit about gluttony earlier that evening. The surviving trial transcript includes the chilling justification. Their art mimics life too closely not to influence it. What makes this persecution particularly tragic is how it twisted the jester's greatest gift, reading human nature, into a liability. Those same skills that allowed them to diffuse tension now marked them as manipulators. Their cultural limbo, once a source of protective ambiguity, left them without allies when mobs formed. Even protective measures backfired. Some jesters carried letters of merriment from clergy attesting to their harmlessness, only to have these documents cited as proof of suspicious clerical connections. The echoes of this fear still resonate wherever societies seek simple answers for complex tragedies. The medieval jester's plight mirrors modern scapegoating of immigrants during economic downturns or artists during moral panics. Their stories remind us that the line between entertainer and enemy is drawn not by actions, but by the frightened hands of those who need someone to blame. In the end, the masks cast the darkest shadows, and those who live between worlds often fall through the cracks. The final curtain fell not with applause, but with silence, a cruel reward for those who had spent lifetimes sparking joy. Medieval jesters faced a bitter paradox. The same society that showered them with coins in their prime abandoned them when age stiffened their joints and slowed their wit. Unlike knights who retired to monasteries or craftsmen who passed shops to apprentices, entertainers had no guild pensions, no lands to till, only the fading echo of laughter that once paid their way. Consider the fate of a French jester whose name meant the laugher. Court records show he served the Duke of Anjou for 40 years, surviving 3 regime changes with his sharp tongue intact. Yet when arthritis twisted his fingers too badly to juggle in 1502, he was given a single gold coin and sent to beg at monastery gates. his story wasn't unique. Tax rolls from Tudor England list former entertainers among the sturdy beggars, rounded up for forced labor, men who had once made Henry VIII weep, with laughter now breaking stones for bread. Women entertainers fared even worse. The ballad singer known as Old Mag of Chester appears in civic accounts only twice. First in 1498 receiving payment for a mayoral celebration, then in 1522 being fined for lewd singing at age 70. Without husbands or children, many were barred from marrying. They often ended in almshouses where rules specifically forbade idle minstrelsy. Some, like the tumbler Beatrice recorded in a Swiss hospice ledger, were put to work entertaining fellow paupers until their bodies gave out, their art reduced to a survival tactic. The physical toll of their careers hastened this decline. Medical treatises from the period describe retired performers with fool's hump from decades of exaggerated bows, or jester's cough from inhaling torch smoke during fire-eating acts. The bones of one elderly acrobat exhumed from a Paris pauper's grave showed 17 fractures that had healed crookedly, a lifetime of impacts taken for others' amusement. What makes their neglect especially poignant is how thoroughly history forgot them. While famous jesters had their wits recorded in chronicles, the average entertainer vanished without trace. Parish burial records often listed them simply as old fool or tumbling man, their identities erased along with their usefulness. A few poignant exceptions survive, like the will of the English jester Dickey, who in 1549 left his battered lute to a young performer with the note, "May it bring thee more comfort than it brought me." The echoes of this injustice linger today in every aging comedian playing half-empty clubs, every retired circus performer struggling with medical bills. The medieval jester's twilight years hold up a mirror to our own treatment of those who spent lives entertaining us, reminding us that laughter is eternal, but those who create it are heartbreakingly mortal. Their unseen struggles challenge us to ask, when the final joke fades, who will remember the jester facing a medieval crowd was like walking into a lion's den armed with nothing but a feather? You had to tickle their interest without getting mauled. Imagine a packed tavern, thick with the stench of ale and unwashed bodies, where a jester had to command attention without the luxury of a spotlight or amplified voice. Every performance was a high-wire act of social engineering, where the wrong punchline could turn a room of chuckling drunks into an angry mob. These entertainers weren't just telling jokes, they were conducting a symphony of chaos, reading the room's shifting moods like a sailor watches the wind. The tools of their trade were raw and immediate. A skilled jester used their entire body as an instrument, exaggerated gestures to reach the back of the hall, sudden silences to quell murmurs, even strategic pratfalls to diffuse tension. Historical accounts describe performers like of Catalonia, who could silence a rowdy feast by balancing a dagger on his nose, then hold the crowd rapt with whispered satire. Others, like the German jester the Clever, employed call-and-response techniques, getting audiences to chant refrains that doubled as psychological anchors, keeping them invested and under control. Timing was life or death. Manuscripts from the period reveal jesters studying crowd dynamics with the precision of modern comedians' crafting. They'd open with universal humor bodily functions, foolish animals to warm up the room before venturing into riskier material. The infamous three-joke rule, recorded in a 15th century entertainer's manual, advised: first make them laugh with you, then at others, then at themselves, but never in that order. Misjudging this progression could be catastrophic. The Chronicle of Peer, the Jester, recounts how a premature jab at local nobles during a harvest festival sparked a riot that burned down 3 market stalls. Alcohol added another layer of danger. Tavern performances often devolved into drunken participation, with audience members heckling or demanding vulgarity. Smart entertainers carried escape jokes, prepared lines to redirect aggression, like the Welsh minstrel's legendary comeback: "I see your wit matches your breath, both could use some air." Physical comedy served as a pressure valve. When tensions rose, a well-timed tumble could reset the room's energy. The Burgundian fool was said to keep a bladder of wine hidden in his sleeve, pretending to trip and accidentally soak the loudest troublemaker, a trick that earned laughter while discreetly removing a threat. The stakes were highest in politically charged environments. Performing for rival factions at a wedding or treaty signing required the diplomatic finesse of a UN negotiator. The Diary of Italian Jester details how he'd plant allies in the crowd to laugh at strategic moments, creating social pressure for others to follow. Some employed coded gestures. Scratching an ear might signal guards to intervene, while flipping a coin meant switch to flattery. The most successful weren't just funny. They were human barometers, sensing when to push boundaries and when to grovel. What's astonishing is how little has changed. Today's comedians still face drunken audiences and tough rooms, still rely on timing and physicality when microphones fail. The medieval jester's struggle reminds us that real crowd control isn't about dominance, it's about connection. Their ability to navigate chaos without safety nets speaks to a truth every performer knows. Laughter isn't just entertainment, it's survival. And sometimes, the difference between a standing ovation and a flying tankard comes down to a single well-placed wink. A jester's bladder stick wasn't just a silly noisemaker. It was a multi-purpose survival tool, equally capable of provoking laughter or cracking skulls. These deceptively simple props formed an arsenal of social engineering, each item meticulously chosen to serve multiple functions in the unpredictable theater of medieval entertainment. The iconic inflated pig's bladder, often depicted in illuminated manuscripts as a child's toy, could deliver stinging blows when needed, its hollow construction making a startling crack without causing permanent damage. Court records from 15th century Milan describe a jester using one to accidentally trip and swat an overly aggressive noble across the knuckles, turning potential violence into uproarious laughter with perfect timing. Mock scepters and crowns held even deeper significance. Crafted from lightweight wood, but gilded to resemble the real thing, these props allowed jesters to parody authority while maintaining plausible deniability. A surviving example in the Vienna Museum of Medieval Art reveals clever craftsmanship. The hollow crown contains hidden compartments for storing notes or small bribes, while its deliberately lopsided design made the wearer's exaggerated bows even more comical. German jesters took this further with mirror scepters, embedding polished metal discs that caught torchlight to dazzle and distract audiences during risky political satire. The most ingenious tools were those that transformed threat into entertainment. Jugglers' knives had blunt edges filed to look razor-sharp from the stands, while fire-eating torches used chemically treated ropes that produced impressive flames, but burned cooler than true fire. A recently discovered cache of performance gear in Bruges included a miraculous drinking horn with a hidden partition, allowing the jester to pretend consuming vast quantities of wine while actually spilling most into a concealed pouch. This wasn't just trickery, it was self-preservation, enabling performers to maintain sobriety amidst increasingly drunk and volatile crowds. For female entertainers, props often served as covert protection. The delicate-looking ribbon sticks, carried by dancing girls, frequently concealed weighted ends capable of stunning an assailant, while the elaborate headdresses of minstrels sometimes held thin metal plates to deflect projectiles. The Travel Journal of a Spanish physician describes a female tumbler's belt with hidden pockets for quick-access remedies, from mint to mask alcohol breath when performing for clerics, to powdered nettle for rubbing on hands when forced to shake with abusive patrons. Perhaps the most vital tool wasn't carried in their hands, but etched in their minds: the unwritten code of prop etiquette. A jester knew never to point a mock scepter directly at a king, to always drop a bladder stick before approaching royalty, and to let noble children discover hidden tricks as if by accident. These subtle rules formed an invisible armor, allowing jesters to dance along the edge of a fence while maintaining just enough plausible innocence to survive another performance. Their toolkit wasn't just about creating laughter. It was about controlling it, channeling it, and when necessary, defending against its sudden absence. Royal jesters weren't just targets for mockery. They were human shields for nobility, their bodies serving as punching bags for punishments meant for spoiled princes. This brutal practice of whipping boys reveals the darkest contradiction in their role. The same performers who brought joy could be transformed into objects of calculated cruelty with a single royal whim. Historical accounts describe young noblemen learning court etiquette through this grotesque system. Whenever the prince misbehaved, his appointed jester endured the lashes instead. The logic was as twisted as it was practical. Nobles couldn't be physically disciplined without undermining their divine right to rule, but someone had to suffer for their lessons. The case of William, Henry VIII's famed fool, lays bare this chilling dynamic. Court records show that when young Prince Edward, later Edward VI, neglected his studies, was stripped and beaten in the palace courtyard while the royal child watched. The spectacle served dual purposes. It traumatized the prince into compliance while reinforcing the jester's subhuman status. What makes this particularly vile is how it perverted the natural bond between entertainer and charge. Many whipping boys were selected precisely because they'd formed friendships with their noble counterparts, making their suffering psychologically potent. The diary of a French tutor from 1542 describes his horror when the Dauphin's jester, who had been teaching the boy card tricks hours earlier, was caned for the prince's table manners, his muffled sobs audible through the banquet hall doors. Women weren't exempt from this brutal system. The little-known practice of fool's brides saw female entertainers punished for noble girls' transgressions. A heartbreaking illumination in the Barry's manuscript shows a young countess watching as her jester is locked in the stocks for mimicking the girl's rude gesture to a bishop. These performances of pain weren't private affairs. They unfolded before jeering courtiers, the jester's humiliation for maximum instructional value. Some accounts suggest certain nobles deliberately misbehaved to trigger these spectacles, enjoying the power to command suffering as casually as they might order a song. The psychological damage extended far beyond physical scars. Whipping boys developed complex coping mechanisms, often leaning into their pain to survive. The memoir of German Jester recounts how he turned his beatings into comic material, demonstrating exaggerated howls for the court's amusement before the whip even fell. Others, like Italy's, reportedly self-inflicted wounds beforehand, numbing the areas with alcohol to deny their tormentors the satisfaction of genuine reactions. These survival strategies came at a terrible cost, blurring the line between performance and reality, until some jesters could no longer distinguish where their act ended and their anguish began. What's most chilling is how this practice mirrored larger societal hypocrisies. The same courts that preached Christian mercy could justify institutionalized brutality by framing it as education. The same nobles who wept at Passion plays about Christ's suffering inflicted similar torment on human beings they saw daily. Even the terminology was deceptive. Whipping boy sounds almost playful, obscuring the calculated sadism beneath. Modern psychologists might recognize this as classical conditioning taken to grotesque extremes, with jesters as unwilling Pavlovian dogs teaching nobility through negative reinforcement. The echoes of this cruelty linger in today's entertainment industry, in the exploited child stars, the abused stunt performers, the comedians pressured to mine their trauma for laughs. The royal whipping boy story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Throughout history, those who bring joy have often paid for it in pain, their suffering hidden behind grease-paint smiles and the thunderous applause that drowns out their silent screams. Festivals and fairs crackled with an energy entirely unlike the stifling formality of court, a momentary escape where jesters could breathe without nobles pulling their strings. For a few glorious days each year, the rigid hierarchy of medieval society loosened its grip, and performers found themselves in a rare space where creativity trumped protocol. Market squares transformed into stages, with crowds of commoners and merchants replacing the usual audience of scowling aristocrats. Here, a tumbler could attempt daring new flips without risking a noble's disapproval, and a satirist might mock local officials with relative impunity. The records of the Great Chesterfield Fair in 1423 describe a jester named Patch performing a scandalous skit about tax collectors, an act that would have earned him a whipping at court, but here won him a standing ovation and a hat full of coins. The atmosphere at these gatherings pulsed with possibility. Unlike court performances, where every gesture was scrutinized for hidden meanings, fair crowds embraced raw, unfiltered entertainment. Jugglers experimented with dangerous new routines, fire eaters pushed their limits, and ballad singers tested songs that would never pass the censor in noble halls. A surviving account from a traveling troupes ledger notes they reserved their most marvelous and terrible feats exclusively for festival crowds, like the legendary Dance of the Flaming Swords, performed only during the Feast of Fools in Burgundy. For performers used to walking on eggshells, these events offered the exhilarating chance to simply let go. But this freedom came with its own dangers. Without the protective cloak of noble patronage, entertainers faced volatile audiences and opportunistic thieves. The Diary of a German Minstrel describes how his troops' earnings from the Frankfurt Autumn Fair were stolen by cutpurses moments after their final bow. Local authorities often saw traveling performers as nuisances, imposing arbitrary taxes or demanding bribes for performance permits. Worse still were the rivalries between troupes competing for prime performance spots, sometimes escalating into actual brawls. A municipal record from Arras details how 3 jesters were jailed in 1461 after a midnight melee involving juggling clubs and a stolen sausage. Yet for all these risks, festivals held an even greater promise: connection. Away from the isolating grandeur of castles, performers finally mingled with peers, sharing techniques, stories, and hard-won wisdom. The legendary Fools' Parliament at the Saint-Denis Fair near Paris became an unofficial guild meeting where veteran entertainers passed down survival tricks: how to spot a generous tipper in the crowd, which herbs could soothe a strained voice, or the subtle art of flattering local officials without losing self-respect. These fleeting exchanges formed the closest thing itinerant performers had to community. The most poignant aspect of these gatherings was their transience. Like a bright flame burning too quickly, the magic always ended too soon. As fairs wound down, performers packed their props with aching muscles and hoarse voices, trading newfound creative freedom for the familiar grind of courtly servitude or the open road's uncertainties. But in those brief, shining moments when the world laughed with them rather than at them, jesters caught a glimpse of what their art could truly be: unbound, unafraid, and utterly alive. The memory of that feeling, more than any coin or applause, carried them through the darker days ahead. Beneath the grease paint and exaggerated grins, medieval entertainers harbored secret selves, rich inner lives that rarely matched their public personas. The few surviving personal writings from jesters reveal a startling contrast. Men and women who spent their days provoking laughter often spent their nights wrestling with profound melancholy or chasing artistic ambitions far beyond their prescribed roles. Take the Diary of the Merry, a 15th century jester to the Duke of Burgundy, discovered tucked inside a prayer book. Between accounts of uproarious court performances, he penned delicate poetry about migrating birds and composed intricate musical notations in the margins, creative outlets his noble patrons never suspected. For some, this private world became a sanctuary from relentless performance. The letters of Isabella, the Tumbler, exchanged with a nun cousin in Avignon, describe her ritual of washing away each night's makeup while reciting psalms, a symbolic stripping away of her fool's mask to reconnect with her true self. Others found solace in unexpected hobbies. Tax records from Nuremberg show the jester owning an extensive collection of dried flowers, while excavations at a former minstrel's quarters in York uncovered carefully carved wooden figurines hidden beneath floorboards, evidence of quiet hours spent crafting beauty away from prying eyes. The most heartbreaking revelations come from their unguarded moments of doubt. A fragile parchment found lining a jester's hat in a Spanish museum contained a scribbled prayer: "Dear God, let them laugh at my act, not my soul." Similarly, the memoir of French performer the Lightfoot breaks off mid-sentence during a passage about his dead child, the ink blurred where tears fell centuries ago. These raw glimpses expose the toll of perpetual performance, the exhaustion of being forever on, the loneliness of knowing your truest self would never be as valued as your caricature. Yet within this hidden world also flourished remarkable resilience. Some entertainers covertly nurtured creative rebellions. The account books of English minstrel Dick list purchases of expensive parchment and inks, materials he used to secretly illustrate subversive comic books mocking his noble patrons. Others, like the German jester Till, turned their private studies into acts of quiet defiance, teaching themselves to read when literacy was forbidden to their class. A recently decoded cipher in a Venetian fool's diary reveals detailed observations about court intrigues, not for blackmail, but for what appears to be an unfinished novel about power and deception. What emerges from these fragments is a portrait of artists straining against their era's constraints. The jester who practiced calligraphy by candlelight, the tumbler who composed philosophy in her head during performances, the ballad singer who hid feminist allegories in nursery rhymes. They weren't just entertainers, but clandestine intellectuals. Their stories force us to reconsider the medieval fool not as a simpleton, but as a complex figure navigating the impossible tension between survival and self-expression. In their secret writings and private acts, we find the most human truth of all, that behind every mask lies someone yearning to be known. The echoes of medieval jesters resound in every comedy club and late-night show today, their ancient struggles shaping the very DNA of modern humor. That tightrope walk between truth and safety. It's the same high-wire act Dave navigates when tackling politics, or John Oliver balancing satire with journalistic punch. The jester's motley has simply been swapped for a suit and tie, their bladder sticks replaced by microphones. But the game remains unchanged. Consider how medieval fools used allegory to critique kings, much like modern comics employ pop culture references to skewer politicians. When a jester compared a noble's tax policy to a greedy badger, and Noah compares congressional gridlock to a toddler's tantrum, they're wielding the same weapon: laughter that slips past defenses to deliver uncomfortable truths. Yet the parallels run deeper than technique. The psychological toll documented in medieval performers' diaries, the exhaustion of perpetual performance, the isolation behind the mask, finds eerie reflection in contemporary comedians' mental health struggles. Robin Williams' tragic battle with depression mirrors the fool's melancholy described in 15th century physician logs. The medieval jester who drank himself to sleep after making kings laugh now has his counterpart in the stand-up comic medicating anxiety between shows. This isn't coincidence. It's the inevitable cost of professional joy-making across centuries. Even the financial precarity persists, where medieval entertainers hoarded coins tossed by nobles. Today's comics hustle for streaming residuals and subscriptions. What medieval jesters pioneered was more than entertainment. It was a survival manual for truth-tellers in hostile environments. Their secret language of coded satire birthed traditions we now take for granted. The court fool's practice of testing the waters with harmless jokes before venturing into riskier material evolved into today's comedy warm-up acts. Their strategic use of call and response to gauge crowd temperament lives on in audience participation segments. Even the concept of celebrity roasts traces back to medieval. flightings, ritualized insult battles, where jesters traded barbs with nobility under controlled conditions. The most profound legacy lies in humor's unchanging role as society's pressure valve. Just as jesters diffused court tensions after failed battles, modern comics help process collective trauma, from George Carlin's post-Vietnam rants to the surge of pandemic humor on Tick. That cathartic release remains humanity's constant, whether delivered in a castle hall or through a smartphone screen. The medieval fool who made peasants laugh about crop failures gave them strength to plan again, just as today's memes about economic struggles help millennials cope. Perhaps the greatest tribute to these ancient entertainers is how thoroughly their innovations became invisible foundations. Every improv, yes, and rule, every satirical news show's exaggerated anchor, even the concept of comedic timing, all were refined in those dangerous medieval courts. Their true monument isn't in history books, but in the unbroken chain of laughter stretching across 8 centuries, proving that while empires rise and fall, the need to laugh at them remains eternal. The next time a comedian's joke makes you gasp, then giggle, remember, somewhere, a long-dead jester is nodding in recognition. Among the countless jesters lost to history, a few names burned bright enough to defy time's erasure, not just as entertainers, but as cunning survivors who turned their precarious position into improbable legacies. Take the sharp-tongued jester who served 2 French kings in the early 16th century. His legend hinges on a single razor-edged moment when King Francis I, enraged by a joke at his expense, swore to execute him, only for to retort, "Majesty, the church forbids killing a fool without cause." The court froze. That split-second gamble wasn't just wit, it was in psychological judo, using the king's own piety against him. The punchline. Francis not only spared him, but granted the privilege of choosing his own manner of death. A gift the jester cheekily deferred for decades by replying, "By old age, sire, in your glorious service." Then there's Roland whose absurd niche earned him immortality in royal records. Granted lands by King Henry II in 12th century England for his singular talent of performing 1 jump, 1 whistle, and 1 fart annually at Christmas court, Roland turned flatulence into feudal security. Behind the crude humor lay genius. He'd identified a demand so specific that no rival could replace him. The royal charter detailing his rewards survives, proving even monarchs understood the market value of comic relief. But not all famous jesters relied on shock value. The so-called French Socrates in Motley wielded humor as a diplomatic scalpel. During France's bloody wars of religion, he mediated between Catholic and Protestant factions through satirical plays so incisive that both sides claimed victory, all while secretly funneling intelligence to his patron, Henry III. His murder in 1591 by the Duke of Guise's men wasn't just assassination. It was an admission that his jokes held terrifying power. Women, too, carved their names into this dangerous pantheon. The Quick, a 14th century German jester whose real name was lost, became legendary for her ability to improvise rhyming couplets that exposed noble hypocrisy. When accused of witchcraft for predicting a bishop's death through verse, she turned her trial into a performance, so dazzling the charges were dismissed. Though history hints her acquittal, came only after compromising letters about the bishop's misdeeds mysteriously appeared. What unites these figures isn't just talent, but tactical brilliance. They understood that survival hinged on making themselves indispensable, whether as stress relievers, truth-tellers, or living reminders of a ruler's benevolence. Their stories reveal the hidden calculus behind medieval laughter. The right joke at the right moment could buy not just bread, but protection, land, even a fragile kind of freedom. In an era when most entertainers vanished without trace, their names endure precisely because they played the game better than kings themselves. The court jesters' bells might have jingled across medieval Europe, but the echoes of their laughter rippled worldwide, because the need to speak truth through humor knows no borders. While European jesters navigated the razor's edge between mockery and survival, their counterparts in Asia's imperial courts were perfecting an even more delicate art. Take China's entertainers who served emperors as early as the Han Dynasty. These quick-witted performers wielded riddles like daggers, cloaking political critique in wordplay, so intricate that offending the wrong noble could mean losing not just their job, but their tongue. A Tang Dynasty scroll depicts one such performer, Jiao, who avoided execution for mocking the emperor's military failures by embedding his satire in a seemingly innocent poem about fishing nets, only revealing the double meaning when safely out of sword's reach. Across the Sea of Japan, the imperial court faced a different balancing act. Part comedian, part social lubricant, these masters of wit were expected to keep conversations flowing at aristocratic gatherings while subtly reinforcing social hierarchies. A 17th century manual for training spells out the peril. Make the Lord laugh, but never let him feel your breath upon his rice. Their survival depended on a technique called laughter that doesn't fly too far, where every joke contained its own built-in apology. The Diary of Renowned reveals how he once diffused a shogun's rage over a spoiled hunt by comparing the fleeing deer to the Lord's own merciful heart, too swift to be captured. The room erupted in relieved laughter, but later writings confess he vomited from stress afterward. In the Ottoman Empire, the tradition turned folly into philosophy. These turbaned jesters, often depicted riding backwards on donkeys, couched biting social commentary in seemingly absurd parables. When it joked about searching for his lost keys under a lamp, not where he dropped them, but where the light was better, he wasn't just eliciting chuckles. He was holding up a mirror to bureaucratic incompetence, a move that could earn either applause or a stint in the stocks depending on the Sultan's mood. Court records from Istanbul describe how one survived 3 regimes by adapting his act. Playful anti-clericalism under a secular ruler, bawdy tavern tales when conservatives took power, always reading the winds like a sailor senses storms. Africa's griots and praise singers prove that jesting wasn't always about subversion. In kingdoms like Mali and Zulu, these custodians of oral tradition walked a tightrope between honoring rulers and maintaining their art's integrity. A griot might sing a king's praises all day, then whisper a pointed proverb about hyenas in royal garb to his apprentices that night. The Epic of West Africa contains a revealing moment where a jester reveals a monarch's corruption through an accidental slip during a celebratory dance, his feigned stumble becoming a legendary act of courage. What unites these global counterparts isn't just their role, but their shared understanding of humor as both weapon and shield. Whether dodging samurai swords or Ottoman scimitars, these performers all mastered the same essential skill, making truth palatable to power. Their costumes varied: silk robes instead of motley, turbans rather than caps, but the person beneath faced identical dangers. A Yoruba proverb puts it best: the dancer who leaps highest must also know how to land softly. In every culture that valued laughter, someone had to perfect the art of the soft landing, often while the ground beneath them burned. The grinning fool of storybooks, forever twirling his baton, forever free from care, is perhaps history's most seductive lie. Medieval jesters weren't the whimsical sprites of fairy tales, but survivors navigating a world where laughter was currency and their humanity was the price. Consider the stark contrast between Shakespeare's Puck and the real-life account of Will, Henry VIII's jester. While Puck flits through forests sprinkling mischief, Diary recounts nights spent stitching his own wounds after courtiers, playfully, stabbed him with dinner knives to test his pain tolerance. This dissonance between myth and reality reveals how thoroughly society has whitewashed the jester's suffering, turning their trauma into caricature. The romanticized image crumbles under historical scrutiny. Illuminated manuscripts may show jesters lounging at feasts, but court physician logs tell a different story, pages filled with treatments for fool's fatigue, a catch-all term for the physical and mental collapse that came from perpetual performance. The 14th century physician described this condition as a withering of the spirit from too much false mirth, noting patients who developed facial spasms from maintaining exaggerated smiles. Even their famed freedom of speech was an illusion. What good is the right to mock a duke if your next meal depends on his goodwill? The Chronicles of Burgundy recount how Jester Peer earned his surname by daring to criticize the crown, only to have his tongue nailed to a tavern door as a lesson in liberty. Women entertainers faced even contradictions. Ballad singers like the celebrated France were simultaneously adored for their artistry and denounced as harlots. A church mural in Chartres Cathedral depicts a female tumbler mid-flip, her face beatific, but the original accompanying text, later scratched out by censors, called her Satan's gymnast. This duality forced impossible choices. The German minstrel reportedly wore a hair shirt beneath her sequined costume, mortifying her flesh to atone for the sin of entertaining. The most insidious myth is that jesters loved their work. Surviving personal accounts paint a haunting picture of ambivalence. A faded letter from Spanish jester to his brother confesses, "I hate the sound of my own laughter now. It rings in my ears like a funeral bell." Another, found tucked inside a French jest book, contains a child's drawing of a frowning man in motley with the caption, "Papa when he thinks we're not looking." These fragments expose the emotional labor behind the profession, the constant self-betrayal of turning pain into punchlines, of swallowing rage to keep the coins coming. Modern parallels abound. Like today's influencers pressured to maintain sunny personas despite burnout, or comedians expected to mine personal tragedy for laughs, medieval jesters were early casualties of the cult of relentless positivity. Their real legacy isn't the merry prankster of legend, but the quiet resilience of those who made light while bearing darkness. When we strip away the romantic veneer, what remains is achingly human, not a grinning mask, but the face of someone who laughed because the alternative was unthinkable. The spotlight may have shifted from torchlit castles to smartphone screens, but the shadows behind the laughter stretch just as long today as they did 800 years ago. Modern entertainers navigate a digital landscape with eerily familiar pitfalls, where viral fame replaces royal favor and burnout lurks behind every trending hashtag. Take the case of a popular YouTuber documenting their daily life with manic energy, only to later confess in a tearful final video that maintaining the persona left them clinically exhausted. Their story mirrors the medieval jester's diary entries describing laughter that cracks the ribs from within. The platforms have changed, but the fundamental equation remains. Audience demand for perpetual joy versus the performer's finite emotional reserves. Exploitation simply wears new disguises. Where jesters once relied on a noble's fleeting goodwill, today's creators depend on algorithmically driven ad revenue and predatory contracts. A tick dancer might amass millions of views while earning less than a fast food worker due to platform payment structures. A digital echo of the medieval tumbler passing a hat after backflips on cobblestones. Record labels and production studios have become the new courts, wielding power over careers with the same capriciousness as any temperamental duke. The tragic case of a child star forced into bankruptcy by coercive management contracts parallels the indentured apprenticeships of young jesters, their childhoods traded for others' profit. Mental health struggles form the starkest bridge across centuries. Medieval physicians documented fool's melancholy in entertainers who could no longer muster genuine smiles. Modern studies reveal comedians exhibit higher rates of depression than the general population. The same cognitive dissonance that plagued jesters, performing joy while internalizing pain, now manifests in influencers editing their depression behind vibrant filters. A haunting parallel emerges between the medieval jester, who drank himself to sleep after making kings laugh, and the stand-up comic, self-medicating with substances between tour. Both exist in the cruel paradox of being simultaneously hypervisible and profoundly lonely. Yet there are glimmers of progress. Where medieval performers had no safety nets, today's entertainers are building collective protections, unions for voice actors, mental health initiatives for comedians, platforms allowing direct fan support. The of a streamer exposing unfair revenue splits continues the tradition of jesters like, who used humor to challenge abusive systems. Perhaps most importantly, modern discourse increasingly recognizes that laughter has a cost, that the person behind the performance deserves care as much as the persona deserves applause. The across 8 centuries isn't just shared struggles, but shared resilience. From castle courtyards to comedy clubs, entertainers keep finding ways to spin pain into connection, to transform isolation into art. Their unbroken lineage proves that while technology evolves, the human need for cathartic laughter and the complex souls who provide it remains timeless. The jester's ghost doesn't haunt us. It lives in every creator who ever masked tears behind a punchline, reminding us that joy and suffering have always shared the same stage. Preserving the stories of medieval entertainers isn't just an act of historical curiosity, it's a rebellion against silence. These performers left behind no grand monuments or official chronicles, Their legacies were etched in fleeting laughter and the occasional scribbled margin of a noble's ledger. Yet by piecing together fragments, a court physician's note about a jester's insomnia, a tax record listing a tumbler's meager earnings, a faded sketch of a puppet show in a monastery's prayer book, we reclaim voices that power sought to erase. Their struggles mirror our own contemporary battles. The gig worker's precarious hustle, the artist's tension between integrity and algorithms, the exhaustion of performing optimism while battling private despair. Consider the resonance of their creative resistance. When a 15th century jester like Hans staged thinly veiled satires about corrupt bishops, he wasn't just entertaining. He was proving that humor could be a Trojan horse for truth. Modern parallels abound. Think of comedians using stand-up to critique systemic injustice, or tick smuggling subversive commentary into viral dances. The medieval fool's survival tactics, coding dissent in allegory, reading rooms to gauge safe boundaries, live on in every creator who's ever self-censored to skirt platform bans or appease sponsors. Their ingenuity reminds us that art under pressure doesn't vanish, it adapts. Beyond political echoes, these stories humanize the cost of joy-making. The Diary of a Spanish Jester, recently deciphered from shorthand, contains a heartbreaking entry. Today I made the Duchess weep with laughter while my own child lay feverish in our rented room. This duality, outsider and confidant, truth-teller and target, still defines entertainers today. Pop stars crumbling under tour schedules, comedians wrestling with depression after filming happy specials. They walk the same emotional tightropes as their medieval counterparts. Recognizing this lineage fosters empathy, challenging us to see performers not as content-producing machines, but as vulnerable humans. Preservation also corrects historical distortions. For centuries, jesters were depicted as simpletons or villains in morality tales, their complexity flattened. But when we examine primary accounts, like the legal petition of a female minstrel demanding back wages in 14th century Bruges, or the inventory of a deceased jester's belongings listing philosophy books alongside juggling pins, we encounter multidimensional people. They were satirists with PTSD, working parents balancing between shows, artists smuggling subversion into slapstick. Honoring their full humanity reshapes how we view today's entertainers beyond their personas. Most importantly, these rediscovered narratives validate resilience. The German jester's practice of carving tiny, hope-filled figurines during exile, the anonymous ballad singer who turned her banishment into a traveling protest song. These aren't just historical footnotes. They're blueprints for surviving creative burnout in any era. When a modern podcaster cites medieval jesters as inspiration for navigating cancel culture, or when a circus artist studies tumblers' injury remedies from guild manuscripts, the past becomes practical. Their stories whisper across centuries. You are not alone. This struggle is not new, and laughter can be both weapon and lifeline. By amplifying their voices, we do more than revisit history. We restore dignity to the damned. Every time we acknowledge the jester who made kings laugh while starving, or the acrobat who performed on broken bones to feed her children, we reject the lie that entertainment is trivial. Their lives demand we ask harder questions. Who today performs our joy at personal cost? What truths are our modern fools smuggling into the spotlight? And how will future generations remember or forget their sacrifices? The answers begin with listening, really listening, to the echoes behind the laughter. The life of a medieval jester was a tightrope walk between celebration and survival, where every burst of laughter came weighted with invisible costs. These performers mastered the art of turning pain into punchlines. Their exaggerated smiles hiding fractures we're only now beginning to recognize. What makes their legacy so haunting isn't just the hardships they endured, but how little the fundamental challenges of performance have changed across 8 centuries. The modern comedian battling hecklers mirrors the jester deflecting a noble wrath. The tick creator juggling authenticity and algorithms echoes the tumbler adjusting routines for each new town's sensibilities. Consider the parallels in our language alone. When we say someone wears the fool's cap for speaking uncomfortable truths, or describe a precarious situation as dancing for one's supper, we're channeling the jester's world into modern metaphor. Their struggles birthed concepts we now take for granted. The idea that humor can disarm power, that performance requires emotional labor, that laughter often springs from the deepest wells of sorrow. Even the term slapstick owes its origin to those medieval bladder sticks that could entertain or intimidate with equal ease. Yet there's a crucial difference between then and now. While modern entertainers have unions, therapists, and digital platforms to amplify their voices, medieval jesters stood alone against the whims of power. The anonymous ballad singer whose songs critiqued feudal oppression had no copyright protection when nobles appropriated her work. The aging tumbler with ruined joints couldn't crowdfund his retirement. Their vulnerability magnifies their courage. These were artists who created not for fame or fortune, but because their art was the only weapon they had against a world intent on silencing them. This duality, joy woven from suffering, freedom found within constraints, is their greatest lesson. Today's creators face different challenges, but the core dilemma remains: how to balance truth with survival, how to make audiences laugh without losing oneself in the process. When we watch a satirical news segment or stream a stand-up special, we're witnessing the evolution of traditions forged in medieval courts and market squares. The jester's ghost lives in every mic check, every viral sketch, every backstage panic attack before the lights come up. So the next time laughter lifts your spirits, pause to honor its hidden history. Behind every joke lies an unbroken chain of performers who risked everything to prove humor could be both shield and scalpel. Their legacy isn't just in the laughs they left behind, but in the courage it takes to turn darkness into light, one precarious performance at a time. If these stories resonated with you, share which modern entertainer you think carries the jester's torch. And don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history's forgotten corners. The spotlight fades, but the echoes of their laughter never truly